So we've just talked a little bit about stress and the resulting strain. So we've talked about compression and tension, and we've talked about also shearing. And so let's take that up as we go here. If we had a surface of the earth, let's say, right here, and if we could cut it open and take out a little slice of it, so we're really looking at a block, let's say here. Here's a block of material. We have a tendency, we call these things block diagrams. And sometimes we only use the front part of that block diagram because it's pretty illustrative of the sort of processes that we try to get across. So I'm going to take that front surface here. Now in order to break it, I'm going to put a fracture right through the middle of that thing, right here. There's a fracture, and now I'm going to offset that block along that surface right there, along that break. So a fracture that shows offset or some movement along that surface, that's what a fault is. And so that is a slip surface right there. And that slip surface right there, you can also call it a fault plane now because we have moved one side down relative to the other side. Oftentimes we have to have a key marker bed to make sure that we know for certain that that bed has been moved. So here's our key marker bed. Let's say that's a coal bed right here. So one side has moved down and the other side has moved up like so, relative to one another. So from the block diagram, we have a cross-sectional view, cross-section. And in this view, you can see that the surface has moved down relative to the surface here, and that key marker bed has also moved down here relative to what it was up here. And so this surface right here, you'll recognize as a planar surface, right? We've already been able to describe what planar surfaces are like when we use the term attitude, right? So when we look at attitude, we're looking at strike and dip. In this case, this surface right here has a certain dip, right? So it's inclined from the horizontal. So that surface right there is what we refer to as a dip surface, but we can also say that this is a dip-slip fault. And so because along that surface right here, there's been some slip, right? This particular variety we're going to know as a normal fault. And it doesn't sound like a very sophisticated term, but that conveys a lot of information to geologists. So in other words, if we have a fault surface right there, and it is dipping from the horizontal, it's been fractured, and there's some slip along there, all of a sudden we have a dip-slip fault that is referred to as a normal fault. So normal fault is a type of dip-slip fault. So a normal fault, one side moves down, the other side moves up like that, right? One of the key things we have to look at, we're in geology, is that surface, do we have a key marker bed in there? So what if, I'm gonna throw a hypothetical in here. Well, here, let's just remove, I got a very small whiteboard here, sorry, it doesn't do much for size-wise. It's hard to stretch out and show you the video still in some detail. Here's that surface again, right here. That's the dip-slip surface, and we've already, let's say, shown that a key marker bed, which exists over here, has been offset. So there's been movement like that on this fault side. So that's that half arrow indicates up on that side, down on the other side here, and that's a dip-slip fault. It's a normal fault. We have terms that we use to describe that dip-slip surface right here. Now, if you can imagine, in the old days, they used to have I think it was the Yellow Pages, where they said, let your fingers do the walking. They wanted people to use commercial telephone directories in order to call before you went to a business, right? Save you some steps that way. And they would do this sort of like finger walking, right? And so if you can imagine, you could finger walk up that surface right here, right? You walk up that surface. You get over on this side, there's no way you could walk up something that's overhanging, right? So we use a term. We call this side over here the footwall, and we call this side the hanging wall. If you moved them apart, give them some separation, let's say. Here's your footwall that you could walk up over here. That's the footwall. Here's the hanging wall over here. But we're really only talking about that surface. We're going to collapse it back down together. So the hanging wall is something, in the old days you could see, put your hammer, your lantern on that side over here so you could hang it on that side, right? So hanging wall and footwall are key terms that we use to describe faults. Hanging wall over here, hanging wall. Ironically, they use two words for hanging wall, and for footwall it's just one word. So footwall and hanging wall, and we abbreviate them with FW and HW here. And so in this case, the hanging wall has moved down relative to the footwall, and that is the definition of a normal fault. So a normal fault, the hanging wall, normal fault, hanging wall goes down relative to the footwall. Okay, that's easy enough. And so this is one type, one variety of dip-slip fault. Dip-slip fault. So the hanging wall moves down relative to the footwall. That's a normal fault here. What if it did the other opposite of that? Let's erase all of this. We'll leave this as the hanging wall right here, right? Okay, or excuse me, as the slip surface right here. This is still the hanging wall, right? And that's still the footwall. That doesn't change. That's always the same. And here's our slip surface right here. It's a dip-slip fault. We're going to move one side down and the other side up. This time we're going to do it this way. And here's our key marker bed. And we can show that there's offset. Okay, so yeah, this side's gone down relative to that side. So if that goes down and this side goes up, that's another type of fault, and that's called a reverse fault. And that's where the hanging wall is up relative to the footwall. It's still a dip-slip fault, so that's A, this would be B. Here's our reverse fault, second type. Normal fault is the first type. And so now the hanging wall has moved up relative to the footwall. Well, okay, let me back up one moment here. And you guys know which side's the hanging wall. It's still this side over here, right? And it's still the footwall over here. And now if the footwall has gone up relative, or the hanging wall has gone down relative to the footwall, you know that that's a normal fault right here. How do you get normal faults? You're pulling things apart. You're applying tension to it. In other words, you're applying a stress field that is tensional. And so when you tension something like this, it results in what we call extension. So extension would be pulling this area apart. Now, if you look at that, this has actually been lengthened that distance right there. If you look up that slip surface and then over to the fault over here. So it's been extended somewhat. You're pulling it apart. In this case, from there to there, we're pushing it together. So compression is responsible for reverse faults. Compression. This one is tension. So normal fault is a type of dip-slip fault that has been exposed to tension, and the hanging wall moves down relative to the footwall. A reverse fault is where the hanging wall moves up relative to the footwall, and it's a result of compressional forces or compressional stress. Compressional stress. So those are two types of dip-slip faults right there. We're going to give a little bit more detail, okay, in just a couple of minutes here. If those are some of the varieties of dip-slip faults, what if we have other types of dip-slip as well? What if we have, let's say, I'm going to break that surface. We have a fault that goes off, an earthquake, let's say, and we have a low angle fault here. This is going to be the hanging wall. This is going to be the footwall here. What if that side has moved up relative to this side? Well, by definition, if the hanging wall moves up relative to the footwall, that's called a reverse fault, right? So the hanging wall moves up relative to the footwall. That's a reverse fault, but this is a special variety. And again, we're pushing and compressing these rocks. And what happens is you may get some slip, and it's slipping over the top. So now we're pushing that over the top of these rocks here. And this is a particular variety of reverse fault called a thrust fault. And the reason I tell you about this is because that is one of the dominant varieties of faults that we see in places like eastern Tennessee and the Appalachian Mountains. So in the Appalachians, you have a lot of reverse. They usually face the other direction, however, but that's okay too. Here's a hanging wall. Here's the footwall. The hanging wall's moved up relative to the footwall. You have to have a key marker bed. Let's say here's our key marker bed here and up here. That side's obviously moved up and over the top of the other one. That's a thrust fault. Oh, well, you may have a question now. Trying to anticipate your questions here. What if it goes this way? Or what if it's flat, right? Which one's the hanging wall? Which one's the footwall then? Well, it's got to be the footwall up here, right? And that's got to, well, no, that's got to be the hanging wall, right? It's got to be the footwall down here, right? Why? Because we can walk on the footwall. You can't walk upside down, right? That's the other side, right? You can't walk on that. If you were to separate them, it's like you'd be falling on the floor, right? You'd be falling down on the footwall, in fact. In this case, that's the footwall over here, and this is the hanging wall over here. Let's do some more. What about that one? Hanging wall, footwall, or is it footwall and hanging wall? Well, hard to tell if it's vertical, right? You have to look for a key marker bed, right? Now, how are you going to force two of those things together? That's not going to have compression, right? This must be due to tension, right? If you're going to break it and you have some offset in the bed, it's still indeterminate. Who knows what that is, right? It's not, you don't get a hanging wall, a footwall, and a vertical fault. It doesn't make any sense, right? So we just say it's a vertical fault. Easy enough. We solved that problem. In this case, it's probably still tension that leads to that, so we'd call that a normal fault. But you can't tell what the hanging wall and the footwall are on a vertical fault. That's vertical. This is not vertical here, right? That's always going to be the hanging wall here. This is going to be the footwall here. Let's take some more. Okay, what about that? Well, that's the hanging wall up here. That's the footwall down here. Hanging wall, footwall, hanging wall, footwall. You get some experience with this, right? Hanging wall, footwall. This is going to be the hanging wall now, right? That's going to be the footwall, because you could walk up that surface right there, right? And sorry for the sound effects. It just sounded appropriate for the time. Hanging wall and footwall. So you already know about dip-slip faults, and you know about reverse faults and normal faults. So dip-slip can be divided into normal, which is equal to tensional fault, right? Tensional forces or tensional stress. And then a reverse fault, which is due to compression, right? You're pushing things together. So thrust is a sub-variety of that, where it's a low angle reverse fault, low angle. What I encourage you to do is play with your hands. Boom. There's our slip surface right there. You can slip one hand over the other. Easy. What if you slip it that way? Well, the hanging wall has moved up relative to the footwall. That's a reverse fault. It's a thrust fault if it's low angle. What's low angle? Less than 30 degrees. 30 degrees is right there, so that would be considered to be a thrust fault. So if this side moves up relative to that side, and again, you're compressing it, right? You have to push one over the top, essentially. If it's a normal fault, it may be like this, right? So you put the hanging wall moving down relative to the footwall. Here's your footwall. You can walk up it. Here's your hanging wall over the top of that. and it moves down on that surface, that's a normal fault. And then you're probably going, it's like, what if you have a low angle normal fault? What if we did this? Again, you can tell it's tensional. My elbows right here, right? You can feel your elbows get wider apart. It's harder to do that if you're doing this, right? Okay, because you're compressing it then, right? But now we're doing tension, right? And so I'm slipping this surface like that. So there is a subvariety of normal fault that is low angle, and we call that it's a low angle normal fault. We call it a detachment fault. Detachment fault equals a low angle normal fault. Whereas a reverse fault equals due to compression, right? And low angle is a thrust fault. Or thrust, sometimes people just call it a thrust. A detachment and a thrust. Low angle version of a normal fault, low angle version of a reverse fault. Due to compressional forces, due to tensional forces. When you have tension applied to rocks, you're extending those rocks. So extension is the net result. Extension. Tension leads to extension. Compression leads to something we call shortening or contraction. Both terms used. Contraction if you're a geologist, and shortening if you're a student of geology. So shortening, you're shortening things up, right? So you're pushing them together, you're sliding one block over the other, you're shortening it. So those are some of the dip-slip faults. If we have one other variety, let's say we have a vertical fault zone here, right? Marker, okay. What if this side is moving into the board and this side is moving out? And these symbols right here are actually from physics, and so that's an arrowhead right here, and that's the fletching or the tail of the arrow right here. So that's going into the board, this is coming out of the board towards us, right? So it's doing this sort of motion along there, like that, right? So that's going into the board on that side, and this side over here. This is still our fault surface right here. It is not dip slip. We may have a key marker bed, but it's not offset at all. So here is our key marker bed, not offset at all, but you know that one side's going in and the other that side's going in, this side's coming out at us. Well, you also know the term for attitudes, we have strike and dip, right? So this is actually referred to as a strike slip fault. It's a long strike. And so you can think about it sliding side by side, right? What's the principal type of stress in that situation? It's shear. They're going side by side, shearing. And so shearing can lead to this type of activity in faulting. Now, let's try to tie it back into tectonics. The main type of fault that you would find, or the main type of plate tectonic boundary that you would find for these types of faults would be those translational sort of like settings or transform plate boundaries. So transform plate boundaries have a lot of strike slip faults. California is a great example of that. San Andreas Fault is a strike slip fault. In California, the state of California here, here's San Diego, LA, you get up this way, here's San Francisco Bay, you go a little farther up, here's Cape Mendocino up here, so California looks something like that, Nevada resting in here, and so the San Andreas Fault comes up this way, goes out to sea, comes back in at Marin, heads out to sea again right there. There's subduction going on out here in California, Northern California, but here this is all strike slip. And it's actually heading that way. like that. And so Baja, California, which, you know, in Baja, Mexico, down this way, this is the Sea of Cortez through here. That is a strike-slip fault, so it's moving up on this sort of scale, right? There's another major fault that runs up back way as well, and it's heading off. Yeah, I think it's heading that way. This fault is. So, but this is a strike-slip fault. That's the San Andreas Fault right here. So the San Andreas Fault is a strike-slip fault. And not only can we say that it's a strike-slip fault, we know that one side's moving one way and the other side's moving the other way on that strike-slip fault. So this would be referred to as a right lateral strike-slip fault, whereas opposed to, let's say you have a surface here that's been faulted, and let's say that it's going this way. That is a left lateral strike-slip fault here. So if you look across the fault, if you're standing over here, looking over here, you'd say that it's going to the left, and so it's a left lateral strike-slip fault. If you're over here and you're on this side looking across, that side's going to the right, it's a right lateral strike-slip fault then. So different types of strike-slip faults, right lateral and left lateral. Left lateral, a good example for that is the Anatolian Fault in northern Turkey. In northern Turkey, the northern part of Turkey is heading to the west, and the southern part of Turkey, most of Turkey, is heading to the east, and that is a strike-slip fault, and it's actually a left lateral strike-slip fault. So, strike-slip faults, pretty important tectonically. So what about the other two? What about thrust faults, and what about normal faults? Well, thrust faults are very common in where you get collisions. And that's what led to the Appalachian Mountains actually forming. You get thrust faults, and it was the collision of Africa and Europe with eastern North America. And you collide. And let me draw eastern North America. Here's New York's here, comes down this way. Here's Florida down here. And the Appalachian Mountains run all along this eastern seaboard here. Well, back 300 million years ago, Africa was in here, and Arabia was still attached at the time, and Europe was sandwiched right in here. So Europe in here. So they collided with North America, and we made a supercontinent called Pangaea. And that collision resulted in the formation of these mountains. Now, when we broke loose again from Africa and Europe, we actually kept some of the African plate in the eastern seaboard. So part of Africa is preserved down here, and then part of Europe is actually in here, and actually part of, like, Scotland took pieces of North America with it up that way, in Britain up that way. So here's Europe. Oh, I can't hardly draw here. Let's see, let's try it again here. Here's France, Italy, so forth, right? You know, so you get the idea. Anyway, so Britain's up here roughly, and part of Scotland came out of North America here. But the Appalachian Mountains right here are a result of that collision. So that's how they got formed in the first place. Not only do they have a large number of thrust faults, particularly in the southern part down in here, they also have a lot of folds in this area up in Pennsylvania. So that is the tectonic setting for where you would get reverse faults and folding, or thrust faults and folding related to collisions. And so, well, where do you get normal faults? And wherever you get tension, right? Well, where's that going to be? That's going to be in the divergent plate boundaries when you're pulling things apart, like the East Africa Rift Zone. If we were to illustrate the East Africa Rift Zone, there's high mountains on either side of the Rift Valley. There are lakes in that valley and volcanoes and things like that, but there's volcanoes on the sides as well. So the Mountains of the Moon, the Ruwenzori, Mount Kenya, Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania. But the Rift Valley itself is relatively low valley, but it's characterized by normal faults. So it's going down in the middle part here and going up on the shoulders of that rift zone. So that's the East Africa rift zone here. So normal faults characterize that sort of setting. We're going to Well, I need to take a break, I guess, and so I'm going to leave it at that for you for right now. There's